Okay, I'm seeing double digits, so in the interest of time, I might start with the housekeeping stuff so that folks can kind of join and get settled in, and then we'll leave as much time as possible for the actual presentation. So welcome to the Collaborative Science for Our Story series. This is Nick Soberall with the Science Collaborative. Today's webinar features a Catalyst project in Florida that's sought to identify ecosystem services that people past and present use and value in the Apalachicola system. And you'll hear more from the project team in just a moment. But before we get started, I'll give a quick intro to the reserve system, the Science Collaborative, and this series. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a place-based program, works in partner with a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities you see on the slide here, which include land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. And the Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. Collaborative Science for Estuary webinar series features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuary management issues. If that sounds interesting to you, look out for future webinar announcements. There are many coming up in the next few months. So keep an eye out for those webinar announcements. A quick note on informed consent. Webinars are one of the ways that we learn as a program. Insights from speakers and participants like you can help inform how we support others in doing collaborative science. For example, in developing future workshops, webinars, or resources such as tools, tips, and case studies to add to our guide to collaborative science, which is open access. With that in mind, we just want to inform attendees that any insights or feedback that you share, for example, in chat or via the webinar exit survey that will launch automatically as you leave the webinar, may be used for program learning and development. Please note that if we capture a direct quote from you that we like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you beforehand and seek permission and provide an explanation of what we'd use it for, and all quotes will be used anonymously. We're grateful for the opportunity to learn alongside all of you. Final note here on housekeeping, all attendees are muted on entry. We'll be handling presentation-related questions via the Q&A feature in your console there. You can enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar. In fact, we encourage it so that you don't lose it. And we'll plan to discuss as many as we can at the end of the presentation. The chat's visible to all, or it will be once we open it up. In fact, Ariana, if you're here, can you go ahead and open up chat to everybody? So you can use that to talk amongst yourselves and ask organizers technical or support questions if you have any. And with that, I'll introduce our speakers for today. Nicole Granan is the Assistant Director of the University of West Florida's Archaeology Institute. Anita Grove is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve. Mike Toman is the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Florida Public Archaeology Network's Coordinating Center and a Faculty Research Associate at the University of West Florida. And Bria Brooks is a Public Archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I appreciate you taking the time to join us for the webinar, Voices of the Past, Planning for the Future, Coastal Resilience and Cultural Preservation in the Apalachicola System. Like Nick said, my name is Nicole Granan. I'm the Assistant Director of the University of West Florida's Archaeology Institute and a PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Today, my co-authors and I are presenting our recent project with the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve, the short title for which is the People of the Apalachicola System. This project is also serving as the basis for my doctoral dissertation. So I'm very pleased to be presenting this alongside three of the core project team members and my co-authors here. And I know Nick introduced them, but I'll just give a shout out real quick to Anita Grove with the Apalachicola Reserve, Mike Toman, who works for the University of West Florida, but is also a board member and treasurer for the Northwest Florida Maritime Landscape Alliance for Preservation, and Bria Brooks, who was a field team member and a former University of West Florida anthropology graduate student, and now a public archaeologist for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Before I get too far into the weeds of the project, I first want to give a thank you to the Florida Public Archaeology Network, Sarah Miller and Emily Jane Murray. Without their prior efforts in the Guantanamo-Matanzas Research Reserve in Northeast Florida, and their willingness to share their methodology, their data, their experiences, this project wouldn't have happened. And I remember distinctly talking to Sarah and Emily Jane about and hearing about a fantastic grant opportunity through NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative. And at the time, I was looking for funding opportunities for my doctoral research. And I reached out to our partner at the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve, who is Anita, about this grant. And as it turned out, the reserve was in need of some assistance with cultural resources work. Particularly work that explored the intersection of the environment and cultural communities, what we would all refer to as ecosystem services. And like many coastal places, Apalachicola and its neighboring towns are on the front lines of anthropogenic and climate impacts. The research reserve's imperative to understand more about this place is thus largely driven by need and a sense of urgency. For those of you who are less familiar with Florida or the Apalachicola Reserve, the project area is situated along Florida's northern Gulf of Mexico coast. The boundary for the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve is outlined here on the right in red. And the People of the Apalachicola System project is a partnership with the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, and it's funded through the grant opportunity offered for researchers working with the reserve system. We were fortunate to receive a 2023 NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative Catalyst Grant for our work, and that grant is managed by the University of Michigan's Water Center. So in addition to the co-authors for this presentation, I also want to quickly mention the many contributions of our other team members. Those include Megan Lamb, the research coordinator with the Apalachicola Reserve, Tom Dawson, the project's technical lead and my advisor at the University of St. Andrews, Dr. Lindsay Cochran, who provided our predictive modeling and the archaeological triage assessment framework, the Florida Public Archaeology Network's Cassie Kemp, who has been working with me to interface with our database and leverage ArcGIS, and Dr. Meredith Martin from the University of West Florida, who has kindly assisted me in navigating qualitative data assessment for ethnographic research. And there are so many partners as a part of this project. One of the fascinating things about the Apalachicola Reserve is that it may be co-managed by NOAA and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, but there are also additional co-management relationships within the reserve among a variety of state and federal agencies, which I can tell you makes permitting for projects like these super fun. Other partners included community groups like the North Florida African American Corridor Project and the Hillside Coalition of Laborers for Apalachicola. And research partners included the North American Heritage at Risk Research Group and the Northwest Florida Maritime Landscape Alliance for Preservation, which is currently seeking a National Heritage Area designation for parts of the Florida Panhandle, including Apalachicola. So I mentioned previously that our colleagues at the Apalachicola Reserve expressed a need to us in terms of understanding the human history in the area, but also understanding how that human history is tied to the natural environment. Driving this work are the visible effects of climate and human impacts on shorelines and coastal areas in the region. So as researchers hoping to work in the Apalachicola area, we took this input and collectively agreed that our work had to be needs-focused, with outcomes that tied directly back to the reserve and the slew of other local land co-managers. And all of this effort is, of course, embedded within a very active community of people who are living and working along the waterfront. Their input was critical to any kind of project outcome. The project also consulted through NOAA with 6 tribal nations prior to beginning this work. And so, Nick, if it's okay, if we can go ahead and send up the first poll for the program. And I'll take this time to introduce our next speaker, Anita Grove, to introduce the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve and its management needs.
Wait till the poll's over or go? Darn. You're on mute, Nicole, sorry.
I think you can go ahead, Anita. The poll will probably just stay up for a minute.
Yes, we were very excited to be a part of this project. The Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve is the second largest in the nation, after Alaska. We used to be the largest. And we were designated in 1979. We're in near Apalachicola, Florida, actually across the river in East Point. And the reserve encompasses 246,000 acres and is 52 miles up the Apalachicola River and floodplain with 2 barrier islands. We are also a UNESCO UNESCO Biosphere Region, which puts us on an international stage also. And the population here mostly was engaged in fishing activities. 85% historically were involved in the fishing industry and predominantly oyster harvesting. We provided 90% of the state of Florida's harvest and 10% in the nation. Change slides. In coordination with our research section lead, Megan Lamb, we worked with Nicole and Mike and Bria on this project and our stewardship section. And for us, one of the biggest needs is, since we've got a small staff, is interpreting the cultural resources, also preservation of these resources. So it really expanded our capacity to be able to document, and we hopefully soon will be interpreting a lot of those results, the cultural sites within our footprint. It gave us also the ability to connect with different sectors of the community and build relationships, long-term relationships, and have a conversation about what people wanted to see done about these resources. So I think that's it.
All right, I'm up next. So as Nicole said, I'm Mike Toman. I'm with the Northwest Florida Maritime Landscape Alliance for Preservation Incorporated. We're a nonprofit organization that's made up of many different organizations throughout the Panhandle that are all trying to preserve the cultural sites and ecological sites that we here have at the Panhandle. So I'm going to very briefly go over the different methods that we use, and I'll focus mostly on site monitoring of these cultural resources, as well as the reporting. And I think some of the other information about the community conversations will be covered in a little bit with Bria. So, so our main methods for this was first site monitoring. And so basically what we were doing was we were looking at doing non-disturbance archaeological fieldwork and recon at 15 priority sites around the reserve that the reserve said that were priority sites for them. And we wanted to also have a good representation of the different cultural communities and time periods. So that's kind of why these 15 different sites were chosen. The second component of the methods we used are called community conversations on heritage at risk. These were focus group workshops where we met with the community members 3 different times and just tried to learn from the community. What did they value? What was important to them in terms of their culture and history? The third was sea levels affecting marshes model, or SLAMM models, to better understand the predicted change related to the gradual sea level rise. And then the last component was reporting through their final manuscript and the project products. Oh, I think I just lost. Go ahead, you can go to the next slide. I think for some reason I lost the shared file. I'm just seeing Anita's. Oh, I got you. Okay, so there we go. So Apalachicola, as Anita said, it's a really amazing place. It's just so beautiful. When you think of old Florida, when you think of snakes and alligators and black bear and sharks and dolphins, we saw all of that along this project. The area of the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve is ecologically incredibly diverse, and that's why it's a UNESCO World Biosphere. So the sites that we visited along the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve included everything from sandy barrier islands to swamps and kind of everything in between. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So instead of going over each of the 15 sites that we visited, I'm just going to focus on one to really talk about the methods we use in terms of how did we monitor these using no disturbance to these sites. And the site we're going to focus on is called the Turpentine Camp. It was one of the first sites that we visited in our rotation throughout our 6 weeks of field work in the reserve. Next slide. And that's us on a boat on the way to the site. And as you can see, the image on the left is showing you where, there you go. Yeah, you can see the boat. So many of these sites were only accessible by boat. And so the Turpentine Camp is located on Little St. George Island. If you look on the image on the right, you can see where that yellow dot's at. That's where the Little St. George Island is located at. And it is, there's no bridge to this island, so the only way to get to it is by hopping on a boat and crossing the bay. So we got a lot of boat work in. Here's a drone shot showing Little St. George Island. You can see that's the dock and the wharf that we had to walk when we actually got to the island. And the site of the Turpentine site was actually just one of several different archaeological sites that we monitored on Little St. George Island throughout our 6 weeks of field work. We can go to the next slide. This is us getting off the boat and walking to the site. The Turpentine site was actually much bigger than we were originally expected. And that's the case that we found with many of the already recorded archaeological sites that we visited. In some cases, we found that the boundaries weren't exactly where they were supposed to be based on the previous visits and what the Florida Master Site File, which is the database that records all Florida's archaeological resources in the state of Florida. And this is one of those cases where this particular site was actually much larger than what was initially determined by the site file. We can go to the next slide. All right, so what do we do when we get to these sites? So the main thing we're doing is documenting. Again, we're not collecting artifacts. We're not doing any sort of excavation. The permits that we had just allowed for us to document these sites. And the way we do that is through a program that we've been doing in the state of Florida called Heritage Monitoring Scouts that we've been doing since 2016. And so basically, when we first get to the site, we try to verify its location. And so we basically walk around and we walk to where the known or recorded boundaries of these particular archaeological sites at, and we determine whether it's there, if it's still there, or we're not able to locate it. In this case, we were able to confirm the location of this site. This is me actually sitting on an area outside the recorded boundaries of the site, and I'm sitting on a pine tree that you can actually see where the cat face marks are on that tree. Cat face marks are from the process of collecting pine sap. And what they were doing was they were collecting pine sap from pine trees, and then they process that sap into all sorts of different products, mainly at this point in time in the early 20th century would have been turpentine. And so as you can see, sometimes what we find is that the boundaries of these particular areas are much larger than what we anticipated. We can go to the next slide. This is Bria and Nicole. They're actually documenting some artifacts. The device you're seeing right there is an Arrow Gold RTK. It's just a very high-powered, very accurate GPS device that can, get a good GPS coordinate down to the, I believe, centimeter. It's incredibly accurate. And so what they're doing is they're recording some artifacts that we came across. When this site was initially proposed, we weren't really sure if we should include it or not because the early reports said that there probably wasn't a lot left of it, that it had been burned. But one of the good things about these, controlled burns is like this, when we do monitoring of archaeological sites is artifacts that are on the surface that are typically covered up by vegetation or pine needles, for example, that we wouldn't see before a burn. After a burn, you can clearly see on the surface. And so what we found was that there was quite a bit of material left. This image shows, again, on the left, you're seeing the cat face cuts into the tree where they would basically collect that sap with cups. In the middle, you're seeing different fragments of glass and metal and brick from the Turpentine camp. And on the right, you're seeing a piece of ceramic, a plate. And so all of these objects, all these artifacts, we would record in place by taking photographs and by taking points with the arrow. Next slide, please. The other really important part about doing any site monitoring is taking overview photos of the entire site. And we do that in a systematic way for each particular site that we visit. So basically what we want to do is once we've bounded the site, we want to take basically 8 photographs. 4 of those photographs will be from the center of the site looking out to the periphery in the 4 cardinal directions. So we'll find the center of the site and we'll take a photograph to the north looking out, to the east looking out, to the south looking out, to the west looking out. Once we have those photographs, then we'll move to the periphery, and then we'll take the same cardinal directions photographs, but looking from the periphery or the outside to the center of the site. And so those are the 8 photos that we take for each site visit. Go to the next slide, please. Once we've collected all that data, we have to fill out site forms. This is the Heritage Monitoring Scout site form, so you can see the basic kind of information that we're recording, whether the site was there, what condition the site's in, impacts that we're seeing, whether it's active erosion, storm surge, animal disturbance, development, human disturbance, any artifacts that we'll see, we'll note those. We'll also list whether the site is considered high, medium, or low priority. So what's great about this database is all the land managers have access to this database, so they can see those reports of these sites that they actually manage. And then really the goal here is not to just collect data from this one visit, but we actually visited each of these 15 sites 3 times, several weeks, or in some cases a month apart. So we're seeing what sort of changes are happening over time. We can go to the next slide, please. Oh, it's the same one. That's the site form. We also upload all the photographs to the same database. The other thing that this project focused on was looking at how much the shorelines have changed. This turpentine camp went all the way up to the shoreline, and we saw evidence of active erosion of probably a trash midden associated with that turpentine camp. If you go to the next slide, one of the way we were able to measure or record the shoreline erosion was again by using the arrow gold. And basically what we would do is walk along the shoreline and take points at a set of intervals to get an accurate location of exactly where that shoreline was at. And basically the areas that we were getting pinpoints for was where there was vegetation on the shoreline. There was still vegetation on the shoreline. If you go to the next slide, you'll see this is an overview map showing of the areas that we recorded shoreline loss from. You see the little green sections, the little green lines. Those are the areas where we were collecting shoreline erosion data. As you can see, we tried to focus, get a good idea looking at the entire bay system of where those were located at. And we would do this for each site visit. So each of the 3 times we would collect this data. And then we'll go on to the next slide to show kind of the area. And so this is the turpentine site. So as you can see, it's a nice long walk along the shoreline. But we can use this data to basically say, how much shoreline has eroded based on each visit. And that's pretty much the methods for monitoring an archaeological site. And we did this, again, 15 different sites, 3 different times each over a period of 6 weeks. And I think you're up next, Bria, to talk about community conversations.
Okay, so I am Bria, and I am a public archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network, but I also worked as a field and research assistant in the project for the People of Apalachicola Project. So one of the most important methods for our team was to garner community feedback and direction for this project. And we did this through community conversations on heritage at risk, or CHAR. These were 1-hour focus group style workshops that were modeled based on those done by Tom Dawson, who's Nicole's advisor at St. Andrews, and also Joanne Hambley in Scotland for their similar work that was similar to the work we were doing in Apalachicola. These community conversations were approved workshops that were ran through the University of West Florida's Institutional Review Board, or IRB, and also the University of St. Andrews Ethical Review. Next slide, please. So we held these community conversations over the course of 3 months at 3 different locations in the Apalachicola region. We rely heavily on our reserve colleague and the City of Apalachicola's liaison, Anita Grove, to gather a variety of representative people who would be in the room during these community conversations. Anita did an amazing job. She delivered exactly what we needed, and we were able to engage over 40 people during the 3 months at these 3 conversations. Now, 40 people might not seem like a lot, but you have to take into account that Franklin County is the 3rd least populous county in the state of Florida. So in the 2020 census of the city of Apalachicola, Florida, Apalachicola was only documented to have 2,341 residents. So having 40 individuals in this area actually participate in these community conversations was a very successful turnout for this project and proved to be successful as well. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to quickly discuss why ethnographic data for community conversations are important for archaeological projects like this. So archaeology is not just for us academics. And when we share archaeology with the public, we foster a sort of appreciation and also a shared responsibility. And with this shared responsibility, we can help protect archaeological sites. And through conversations with the community, we can also advocate for protective measures that suit the actual community's needs and just not what we as archaeologists and land managers think. Next slide, please. So our workshops asked about 8 related questions related to cultural heritage in the Apalachicola region and how people felt about these cultural heritage and resources in the past, present, and also the future. So as you can see with our first question, we started off with a super ballpark question asking people what was their favorite thing about living in the Apalachicola region. Then we asked them to more define cultural heritage. And as the conversations went on, the questions got more particular and more in depth concerning how we should take action to preserve cultural heritage and even connecting the ties between the local community and the local authorities and national heritage agencies. And importantly, ending on how people actually think these cultural resources that they find valuable will hold up years beyond this conversation. Next slide, please. So, and what we got from these 8 questions and these conversations in general was a lot more than just direct answers for these questions. So it became clear to us that the people of this community care deeply for their heritage and that they felt a deep connection to the environment, from what you can see from this quote from speaker 4 in this slide. Next slide, please. So we also saw there was a serious concern for how heritage, and heritage that was a product of people's connection to the environment and how it's essentially in danger because of multiple factors, as you can see in this quote from speaker 10. So the seafood industry in Apalachicola is centered around oysters. The oyster industry once employed up to 85% of the working population in Apalachicola, Florida, and now it's in a serious decline due to the conditions of the oyster beds in Apalachicola, Florida. And because of this decline in the oystering industry, there's a decline in the cultural resources connected to it. Next slide, please. So we also saw that people in this region are experiencing Apalachicola transition into a more typical service and hospitality industry as we see in other regions in Florida. And they are not necessarily happy about this at all, which you can see in this quote. So with these changes in Apalachicola becoming a more service industry, people's cultural resources are shifted. It impacts their traditions, it impacts their foodways, and also their connections to the natural resources. So while discussion about the oyster industry is much longer than we can actually talk about here in this webinar, the restoration of the oyster industry is being hindered by a few circumstances, circumstances like climate and lack of fresh water flowing into the Estuarine system in the Apalachicola Bay. Next slide, please. In these conversations, we also saw a huge desire to move beyond histories that glorify cotton magnates and other wealthy business owners and entrepreneurs in the city. The people living in this area during these conversations discussed having deep roots, and they wanted to talk more about the deeper history of the history in the region, about tribal populations, the Maroons, the everyday working people, the laborers, and also the immigrants, and many more underrepresented populations that have moved through this area and throughout this area. But overall, our community conversations for this project were incredibly successful. They provided us with a lot of valuable insight that ended up exceeding our expectations a lot. The knowledge shared by our local participants not only enriched our research, but also helped us uncover and understand the archaeological data as well. And not only did it help Nicole's project, we had so much data from these community conversations. As I said earlier, I actually worked as a research assistant for this project when I was working on my master's research. I was also able to dually use this research to answer questions concerning a maroon fort that is present in Apalachicola, Florida, to continue the research I wanted to engage the community about. And next, we will hear from Nicole to learn more about predictive modeling and the project's findings.
Thank you, Bria. So the final data set that we integrated into this project was one generated by predictive modeling, specifically SLAMM, which stands for Sea Levels Affecting Marshes Model. So as a reminder, here are the boundaries of the Apalachicola Reserve on the right. And that is what you are seeing here. This model and the archaeological triage assessment on the next slide are the work of Dr. Lindsay Cochran of East Tennessee State University. She used a combination of digital elevation models, or DEM, or LiDAR, to produce a mathematical model simulating potential impacts of sea level rise to shorelines and wetlands. The model simulates the processes involved in wetland conversions that will occur with long-term sea level rise, namely things like inundation, erosion, accretion, soil saturation, and barrier island overwash, all of which have already been occurring in the Apalachicola Reserve. The colors you see here represent different categories of the National Wetlands Inventory habitat types. For example, the Kelly green color represents non-tidal swamp. Let's see here. On our initial slide here, you can see that the images here are dated in intervals of 25 years, although it is now 2025, so I guess our benchmark is somewhere in between here. The darker green marsh represents transitional marsh scrub, the brown tidal flat, and the blue as estuarine open water. So without going into this extensively here, what the models seem to indicate is that even in the most conservative estimate of global sea level rise, resulting in a 1 meter local sea level rise, the vast majority of the reserve will be a regularly flooded marsh by 2050. In more extreme scenarios of a 1.5 meter or 2 meter level sea level rise, the majority of the reserve will be some sort of transitional marsh by 2050. I just lost my slide place here. And open water by 2100. Based on the model, Dr. Cochran then helped us identify national wetlands inventory areas and their risk levels for cultural resources within those areas. With no color here, meaning almost no impact, yellow corresponding to a threatened status, orange to a damaged status, and red meaning destroyed. The results from the SLAMM and the archaeological triage assessment are not encouraging. It's important, however, to note that models are not perfect, and we can't account for every force acting within an ecosystem, but we'll come back to that shortly. So in terms of findings, I wanted to go through each phase of the project and discuss what we found. And I wanted to start with site monitoring, which is what Mike initially discussed. So first, the project team found that a site's geographic location within the reserve had important implications for its stability at the time of assessment. Those sites located along the shorelines of Apalachicola Bay and the Gulf of Mexico were generally in poorer condition, with the highest frequencies of observed negative impacts like active erosion, flooding, storm surge, wind, and wave action. Due to their visibility, many of these sites were also prone to foot traffic from visitors to places like Little St. George Island or the beaches along the northern shore of Apalachicola Bay. Many of the shell middens in these shoreline locations also had observed eroding shell components, things like oyster and scallop, in addition to pre-contact ceramics. Next, the relationship between archaeology and heritage is deeply complex. If we understand heritage to be an ongoing process through which communities select aspects of the past to incorporate into their modern identities, and if archaeological resources are tangible remains of that past, then land managers and researchers must weigh preservation decisions carefully. In many ways, and in ways that the project team heard repeatedly from engaged members of the community, these sites and the traditions tied to them are integral to cultural identity and collective memory in the Apalachicola system. And third, although only one of the selected priority sites was flagged in the state's Florida Master Site File, which is a database of all known archaeological sites in the state of Florida, was flagged as having human remains, the project team did indeed encounter human remains at another site. This particular site had been flagged by the Seminole Tribe of Florida during initial project consultation as likely having burial resources. The positive identification of human remains by the project team highlights the importance of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into planning activities for cultural resources projects. And finally, and this is true of a great deal of cultural resources work, you can't always trust past documentation. 6 of the 15 monitored priority sites need extensive updates, including locational updates. A lot of this is likely due to coordinate conversions over the years, but in several instances, the sites were actually quite a bit larger than originally documented, as Mike mentioned. One site location of the 15 could not be verified by the project team at all. What did we learn from our community conversations? And Bria started alluding to a lot of this. Well, following the transcription and thematic coding through qualitative data analysis, we learned that Apalachicola is a place that is changing rapidly. The economy is in transition and the environment is facing threats from climate impact and upsystem development. Gentrification is also happening in historic neighborhoods. We also learned that the people in this place have a strong connection to the natural environment, a relationship that draws heavily from economic activity in the past and modern recreation. There is a particularly important connection to the waterways that surround all of the communities in this area. The community also expressed their desires to enhance the education of young people in hopes of retaining community identity in the face of change, wherever it comes from. That the community's economy is transitioning to a more classic Florida tourism model has created some concerns about job opportunities for keeping young people present and connected. And finally, we heard loud and clear that all people present in the Apalachicola community, past and present, are seen as assets, and they all help define its identity. This came out as something important for prioritizing cultural resources work going forward. All groups need to be represented to get a full picture of the area's history. And I could speak at length about the qualitative data analysis of our community conversations data, but since we're limited in time, I did want to throw up this quick word cloud visual. This very, very quickly conveys all of those themes that were most frequently brought up during the conversations, and it's easy to see which ecosystem services are discussed the most among community members. And then we come back to our sea levels affecting marshes model and the archaeological triage assessment. One of the first things to talk about is that both the model and the triage assessment have very important implications for the work that we undertook with this project, as they seem to indicate that even in very conservative estimates of sea level rise, the vast majority of the Apalachicola Reserve will be some kind of regularly flooded marsh by 2050. In more extreme scenarios, that obviously will change and could be hastened in terms of transitional marsh and open water. These results, of course, we're always double checking our results. They correspond largely to NOAA's sea level rise map viewer, slosh inundation patterns, and prior research efforts from other researchers working in the Apalachicola area. Next, a 1 meter local sea level rise scenario would mean the destruction of at least 13 of the 15 selected sites that we included in this study. The archaeological triage assessment results also indicate that very few of the 145 total archaeological sites within the reserve, give or take, are not likely to be damaged, threatened, or destroyed by 2100 due to shifting wetland categories. And third, and this I think is very important, while we stand to potentially lose archaeological sites, historic structures, and historic cemeteries in this evolving landscape, it's also important to think about the traditions, the foodways, the practices that are tied to those places. How will the loss of one impact the other? What will people carry forward from the past without tangible connections? And finally, archaeological sites, if they exist in a vacuum, they may persist perfectly well during a transition from undeveloped dry land to transitional marsh. Considering the longer course of the region's environmental history, however, changes that are wrought by human interactions with the environment, things like shoreline development or overly exploitative resource harvesting practices like the lumber industry in the area, are really the most damaging to these fragile resources. This is a story that is very much rooted in past human interaction with the environment. So this project took place only over the course of 1 year, which amazes me when I go back and look at all of the work that we were able to accomplish in a short amount of time. And I think I can speak for the entire project team when I say that we feel positive about the outcomes that we had planned for the project. Not only were we able to provide subject matter expertise to the monitoring and recording of cultural resources within the reserve, we also brought together an incredible group of stakeholders that provided context to that work. These community members and land managers also are guiding the discussion on how to better interpret cultural heritage and teach the next generation of residents and visitors to the Apalachicola area. And finally, although predictive modeling is imperfect, and again, it can't account for every factor acting upon an ecosystem, if we combine the SLAMM outputs and the archaeological triage assessment with what our field team saw during on-the-ground reconnaissance and with the critical feedback that we received from the community, we now have marching orders for the foreseeable future. This research provides a strong imperative to dedicate resources towards studying those cultural resources that will be most at risk over the next 75 years and beyond. We have a lot of work to do to preserve the unique cultural heritage of this place. And Nick, at this time, if you wanted to share the results of the poll, that would be great as I start wrapping up. So let's say we're about 50-50 split on whether or not people interact with cultural resources. That's fantastic. Thank you all for providing this input to us. Most people interacting with cultural resources through interpretive exhibits and programs, also very interesting. So building on the work of the people of the Apalachicola System project, the project team has identified several areas for continued research, community engagement, and cultural resource preservation efforts. The project was always perceived to be a launching point, one that could help our project team identify specific needs for cultural resources work in the reserve and the Apalachicola area community. Future work, ideally, would include things like employing sediment coring, carbon-14 dating, targeted geophysical surveys to reconstruct the geological and ecological history of Apalachicola Bay, as well as how communities of people have moved through that space over many thousands of years. We would also ideally like to do continued long-term monitoring of the priority archaeological sites that were in this project and the vulnerable shorelines in this area to build on that baseline data that we have. We also, again, a community imperative to record oral histories with older people who maintain deep cultural connections to the Bay system and to address the community concerns about losing cultural traditions and practices over time. And finally, I think it would also be beneficial to produce an interpretive plan that would assist the reserve and other local land managers in this area with cultural resources interpretation and engagement in the community, particularly for young people. And as much as is possible, here is the list of all of the people that we coordinated with and worked with to get this work done over the last year. The QR code here at the bottom will take you to our project's Open Science Framework page, which after the grant closeout in just a couple days will also feature access to much of our project data, apart from some of the more sensitive site locational information. Thank you all so much again for being here with us this afternoon, and thank you to all of my co-presenters today as well.
Thanks, folks. Okay, at this time, we can start answering some Q&A questions here, I think, and I see one that's already popped up in the Q&A window here. Was there any specific cultural resource that the stakeholders were most concerned about losing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in looking at our community conversations data, there was a lot of concern centered around the seafood industry and the legacy of seafood, particularly oysters in the Apalachicola area. I would say that there was, if we're talking about archaeological sites, the answer might be a little bit different. If we're talking about intangible forms of cultural resources, things like foodways, traditions, then something tied to the seafood industry would be probably the most concern that was voiced. In terms of archaeological sites specifically, there was a lot of discussion about the pre-contact shell mounds and middens that dot the Apalachicola Bay Basin and a lot of the riverine areas as well. I think people see these things in their day-to-day interactions with the environment. They see the erosion happening. Oftentimes they'll see cultural resources like pottery, sherds or shell eroding out of sites. And that, of course, is a reason to draw their concern as well. That's a great question.
Thank you. See some more questions rolling in here, so we'll just keep cranking through them. Can you describe the composition of participants was another question somebody wanted to know.
Yes, absolutely. If we're talking about the participants in the community conversations on heritage at risk, actually, Anita, you might be the best one to field this one since you really leveraged your community roles to help get us people in the door.
To get people who were here, we've experienced, like many areas, of an inundation of people, early retirees. They have a totally different perspective than the local population. So I thought to get people who had been here a long time or who were born and raised here. Not always easy because they're raising families and their, cultural resources are like the last thing on their mind. But I tried to get people who were really a part of the community. The difference in the two audiences is striking. So I think getting the people who were related to the early people, people who came here, especially during the lumber industry and before that era, during the cotton industry, and even before that, was an important audience. And I think, on one of the things that people expressed to me was, we were all very based in the water and the marine resources here. And that's changing. It kind of turned into, everybody likes to compare us to Key West, bars and all of that. So people's perspectives are changing and their idea of the true history is open to interpretation. So we're trying to, somebody had mentioned we need to get the history out there and let people know. And that is a strong desire from everybody who lives here, is get the history of the area publicized and more in the mainstream of the community.
Thank you, Anita.
Another attendee wanted to know how tribes were involved.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Apart from the fact that, working with NOAA as the grant sponsor for the project, and going through the consultation process with 6 tribes that had interest in this area. The tribes, it's kind of an interesting question. We created our community conversations on heritage at risk, where we had, like Bria said, 40 people that we worked with in focus group style workshops. We also created a digital component through Qualtrics, which is basically an online survey, to capture the same kind of data for people who weren't able to be present and in the door with us that day. The Apalachicola area does not have a lot of current tribal presence, and a lot of this, of course, is due to the fact of historical circumstance, with the removal or the movement a lot of tribal communities in the early 19th century. So one of the ways that we tried to get tribes involved, if they weren't present in the community today or weren't a vocal presence in the community today, was engaging them with those Qualtrics surveys. And so we were able to send those out to all of the tribes that were consulted as a part of this project and get feedback from them in that way. Unfortunately, and maybe this is a lesson learned for all of us, is we didn't have a whole lot of interaction with those online surveys. People really seem to prefer talking in those community conversations. So if someone were to ask me how I would do this again in the future, I would lean heavily on that one-on-one or that group style interaction to get community feedback versus a digital survey. That's a really good question.
That's a really good point to bring up.
Absolutely.
Next question, we have a question for Bria. How did you select questions for the survey that you sent out to residents?
So like Nicole just discussed, the questions for the survey were the same questions that we asked in person. And the questions were designed to like get people more engaged on the subject matter and not just yes or no or A, B, or C, but to actually almost let them lay out any type of grievances they may have had. Or that's why the ballpark question was, what's your favorite thing about Apalachicola? We really wanted to have conversations, and we didn't want to talk at people. We wanted them to be able to take the reins over the conversation. Nicole gracefully came up with all 8 questions, and it was a really good way to string everything together, and the questions worked out perfectly to get conversation going.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, Bria, the questions that were used in the project, the 8 questions during the community conversations, were developed in partnership with my supervisor at the University of St. Andrews, Tom Dawson. He and his wife, Joanna, they're both researchers with the University of St. Andrews, have been doing this kind of coastal community engagement work in Scotland for many years now. And they came up with variations of these questions to engage the people that they work with. And so the reason why he's my advisor and I'm working through him is because he is providing me the technical foundation for doing this kind of work in Apalachicola. So that in part is also how some of those questions were put together. And Bria mentioned we put an easy question at the front, and that was a way to get conversation starting. So that is one thing that was different from what they had been doing in Scotland. We just wanted people to feel comfortable when we started getting into the deeper issues of cultural heritage and threats to that cultural heritage.
Sure. Here's a fun one. Somebody posted in the chat. Did music come up as a tradition which the local people wanted to see preserved? And they specifically mentioned jazz as an example.
You want to take that one, Bria?
Jazz didn't come up, but I know for sure people, I think it was Community Conversation 3. I remember people talking about music from church actually being a cultural resource that they wanted to preserve. And that gentrification and all the development downtown was actually drowning out some of the gospel music that usually used to be heard in the communities on Sundays. I didn't hear jazz, but we definitely heard people talk about gospel as a cultural resource.
Fascinating. Any other questions, folks? Don't be shy. Got a few minutes left here. We could squeeze in a few more questions, or if folks don't have any other questions, or if something occurs to you later, we can always add it to the exit survey, but a few minutes left here.
Maybe I'll just add while we're sitting here, if you are thinking about incorporating cultural resources work into what you do, or would like to work with others to do that kind of thing, I would hope that we could be seen as resources for you. All of the data for this project is open access, and it'll be available through our Open Science Framework page and other outlets online. So if referencing that research is useful to you, feel free to use it, but also reach out to us because I would love to have those conversations with other people.
I see a few last minute questions here. One of them is specifically about the QR code. So maybe I'll leave that to tackle offline. A couple of questions here floating in the chat. Can you comment on any lessons or thoughts from this project about how we should understand the tension between maintaining a strong community identity and sense of place in the face of inevitable change? Kind of a big picture question, but I think that's maybe a good one to end on. And we have a few other ones here that I can maybe pass on to presenters afterward.
Yeah, and anyone feel free to jump in. I think, I talk about next steps toward the end of this presentation, and we focused a lot on archaeological sites specifically as a part of this People of the Apalachicola project. And I think while those are important things, what we're hearing from a lot of the people is that it's preserving community heritage through oral histories, doing educational programs, having interpretation of history in publicly accessible spaces that were a real need or a real desire from among the community members. And so, if things are going to change, I think having good educational resources, having good research to back up those educational resources will be one of the ways that we can navigate what is probably inevitably going to be a very difficult thing for many people. And I don't know if any of my other team members want to add anything, feel free to.
It's a big concern, and we are looking for resources to help us quickly.
Maybe I'll float one or two more questions here since we have a few more minutes just to make sure they get answered. Do you happen to remember what some of the tribes were? You mentioned there were 6. Any you could remember are appreciated.
Yes, and I am going through my notes right now. I know we consulted with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. We also consulted with the Miccosukee tribe, which is located here in Florida as well. We also consulted with, I'm going to have a hard time pulling this up in my email on the fly, of course. We consulted with the Choctaw group in Oklahoma, as well as the Seminole tribe group in Oklahoma. And since I can't remember the other 2 off the top of my head, there is a excellent resource called the Tribal Directory Assessment tool that is available online through a government website, a federal website for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I think I'm able to put this in the chat box here. This is an excellent tool that someone, if you have interest in doing research in a particular area, you can search that area by address through this tool and come up with tribes that have voiced an interest in what is happening in that place. So if you do want to engage them, this is a great way to kind of determine maybe who you should begin talking to. But one thing I will say to that as well is this is mostly related to federally recognized tribes. And I think it's important for us to remember that there are other tribal communities in most of our states that aren't federally recognized and that are also worth reaching out to.
That's a good point. The last question here was about living shorelines. So somebody had asked, are the results from this project going to be used by local organizations to implement living shoreline projects? And Anita answered, we use living shorelines on many of our shorelines that are threatened. So if you have any other questions or comments, you can feel free to drop them in the exit survey, which again will close as soon as you exit the webinar. It'll also be included in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow automatically at the same time the webinar started. So that'll have the link to the summary resource page as well. In the next few days, we'll post the webinar recording on that page as well as our YouTube channel. So you can find it in those 2 places. If you don't see it right away, just check again maybe the next day or the end of the day. It just depends on how long it takes us to cut, edit, and upload it. So usually only takes us a couple days though. Be on the lookout for more webinars. There's, like I said, a whole bunch coming up. The next one is actually next Monday, so we have a lot of double stacking the month for the next few months. So lots of projects wrapping up, lots to share. So next webinar would be next Monday, as I said. It's a big nationwide synthesis of marshes that involved all 30 reserves, so that'll be a good one to listen in for. As we wrap up, just want to thank our presenters for taking the time to speak with us today and for answering questions and for putting on such a great presentation. Thank you all for participating and and asking questions as well. And with that, everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, folks.